Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ask Me Anything About Employment with Lou Orslene. My name is David Blair, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar is not a presentation, but an interactive question and answer period. And for the next hour, Lou will take any questions you have related to disclosure and accommodation. Lou has over 25 years of experience in the field of disability employment. He's the co-director of the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, and fiscal officer for both JAN and the Disability Research Policy Center at West Virginia University. JAN is the premier national resource for free, expert, and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment. Today's event is part of the National Resource Center on Employment, jointly funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, and from the Center for Mental Health Services within the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, part of the Department of Health and Human Services. The content of this webinar does not represent the views or policies of the funding agencies, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. During registration for this event, you were given the opportunity to submit a question in advance. So with that, welcome to the webinar, and I hope you enjoy the next hour. Lou, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here today, and a lot of people have a lot of great questions. I'm going to start with one of the ones that was submitted in advance, and then we'll go from there.
Hey, David, I just wanted to thank you guys very much for this opportunity for us to speak today, and just to let everybody know that in addition to me, I'm very lucky that Melanie Wetzel, our lead consultant on the mental health team, was able to join us this afternoon as well. So we'll both be fielding. So again, thanks for the opportunity, and by all means, let's get into the question.
Yeah, and welcome, Melanie. I really hope you do share with us any advice you have, and you can both answer all the questions. I think you bring, a different perspective, so or the same, even that's fine. So our first question comes from Angela. And she asked, when do I need to disclose to an employer that I need an accommodation, and to whom should I disclose it to? As a third party, how can we best help our clients with disabilities maintain employment while still being transparent with their employer? So it's 3 in 1, but I think they're all
related. I think I'll start with the third one first. I think as a service provider, you really need to provide and let the person be the lead in terms of their disclosure and what information is shared with the employer. So I think that's really important in all the work that we do. The person themselves, whoever you're supporting, really needs to be the lead on that. They need to make an educated choice about disclosure. So let's just talk about disclosure then. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the way that the regulations are and practice is that the person themselves really needs to disclose their disability employer. It's their obligation. And certainly what we need to do is we really need for that person to be, again, informed about the implications of that disclosure. And there are a number of great resources out there. For instance, the youth collaboration at one of the TA centers, the technical assistance centers at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, have a publication disclose the 411 of disclosure. There's 2 of them, one for an individual and then one for service providers, advocates, and parents. So I would encourage folks to dive into those really to look at the pros, the cons, and to make an informed decision about disclosure. Disclosure, I'd say, and I'll rely on Melanie to give us her opinion as well. I think it's very situational. I think to determine when you need request an accommodation or disclose, I think a disclosure really needs to address some kind of accommodation. However, if you have a company that is very inclusive, is very far along on the what I call companies like E&Y, companies like Northrop Grumman, large companies which are very well known, are highly rated, or belong to the United States Network, are on the top 10 companies of Diversity Inc.'s list of companies that are friends with disabilities, then it's a much more open environment, and you can, of course, discuss, I think, more readily disability in companies such as those that are very inclusive. But typically people will wait until they need an accommodation. But if you need an accommodation during the recruiting process, say, for instance, that you're really not able to call an applicant tracking system, which are the online career portals at many companies, then at that point, if you can't use it, then at that point you would ask for an accommodation. Or perhaps you can get through the applicant tracking system and you're invited in for the first interview. And for that, realizing, the company has provided instructions of when to arrive, what the building's like, what the expectation is of the interview, and say, for instance, that you have a very challenging time during these interviews at some companies where there are multiple people shooting questions at you in a conference room. Then if you need an accommodation, ask for a more quiet environment, or you ask for a change in that interview process, then that would be the appropriate time to ask for an accommodation. And then you may not, in either of those circumstances, but you may need one, say, during the or once you're an employee of the organization. So at that point. So I think overall, the point that I really want to make is disclosure is very personal, first of all. You really need to be educated in terms of the pros and cons of disclosure. And then it's also very situational in that I would encourage people to learn as much as possible about the company that they are applying, so that they know where that company is on the inclusion continuum, how friendly they are to people with disabilities, and I think that will, too, assist the person in making that determination of how and when. Before I turn it over to Mel, I'm sorry, didn't mean to monopolize this totally, but I would also encourage that the individual, the applicant, candidate, or employee really seek out the publishers of that company, because that really is going to tell you who to disclose to. While we know from research conducted by Cornell that most people will, or a great many people will, disclose to their immediate supervisor, in most companies, in many companies, there are policies, and either you may go to a representative resources in employee relations, or some of the more inclusive companies these days have diverse departments, and one would go to a representative. Typically, there is a subject matter expert, a disability consultant within D&I, and one.
Now, the only thing I was going to say is a lot of times employees don't want their supervisor about, and that's why the idea to go supervisor involved process. And one other thing is you don't want to wait too late to disclose. You want to disclose becomes too much of a problem because the employer doesn't have any kind of that.
And if I could just add to that too,
sure.
I totally agree with that, and I think that's one of the most important parts or point to make, because I think that if you wait too long and there is discipline, then in that disciplinary meeting or that counseling session, that the reasonable accommodation request gets very muddled. And questions, like, why didn't you ask before? Are you using this such? I mean, sometimes it has to happen that way, and it happens. It's not optimal, and you want to, I think, whether one is a supervisor or whether one is the employee, you want to avoid disclosure and requests for accommodation.
Around disclosure, there's a lot of questions that people submitted. And so I'm going to try to kind of go through those here, and maybe we can spend the whole beginning of this just going through things just around disclosure, because it's such a big topic area. Before I do that, James in the room just asked, did he say it is an obligation of the client to disclose?
Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is the obligation of the individual to disclose and request.
Okay.
Unless it's a disability that's known by the employer. So say, for instance, and we could tease this out a little bit further, but I would say most generally it is the responsibility of the disclose. There are circumstances, someone is injured at work. Someone has taken Family Medical Leave Act. So the organization is aware of their disability. They've been certified. They understand the disability has happened. So in that circumstance, then the employer should just be negotiating and should just be talking about accommodation. So everybody is aware that there is a disability that's impacting work. But those are the more rare circumstances. In most circumstances, it is going.
And in the case of someone with like a developmental disability or not really get an accommodation or realize help that be able to start that.
And certainly an advocate or a family member could be part of that disclosure and request for accommodation.
Okay. And then to summarize in terms of the timing of the disclosure, it seems to be the answer is before you need it, not in the heat of the moment, because that'll muddle the message. And it doesn't help. Go ahead. You look like I said something wrong there.
Yeah, no, not before you need it. It would be as you.
Okay.
So for instance, and I'll give you a for instance here because I do want to be real. So there are circumstances where people are very open and very generous with information, and they want to be very honest. So you go into an employer, and during the initial interview, you disclose a disability, and you don't need an accommodation. Unless it is a very inclusive organization that is very far on, we would suggest, and I would certainly suggest against that. I would really just wait. I would wait until so if I could not, because of a cognitive impairment that I had related maybe to my medication that I'm taking, and therefore I'm not able to quickly go through the applicant tracking system, the career portal, to put my application in online. If I'm having that issue there, then I'm going to request an accommodation at that point. I think the point that Melanie and I were making is if it's a performance issue, that you do not want to wait until there's a performance. And I'm really glad we're really discussing this thoroughly because there are lots of nuances of it. So we'll hit it as many times as we need to, right, Mel? To get
yes, and let me just say this too, that sometimes an employee doesn't realize that their performance or their employer can bring that to then it opens up that pathway for a discussion about it.
So going off of all of that, one of the questions that someone submitted in advance, it's actually happened multiple times, is in job applications, it asks if you need an accommodation. And the question is, if they say no there, what's the repercussion?
I think that corporations are simply trying to comply and to be open with people with disability by including that on their job app. My presumption there would be that they're on the application itself, that specific request is such that just so that you know that the company is open, requests for accommodation and disclosure throughout the hiring process. So if you need an accommodation for that process, again, if that statement is on an applicant tracking system online, then unless you would need that accommodation specifically for the process that you're now engaged in, I see no reason to close and to ask for it.
And so I'm trying to group questions because there's so many very, very similar questions that people ask. Deborah, Leslie, people from all over are asking, what's the best way to disclose an individual's disability to a potential? So how do you talk?
Okay. So I really think that the best way is to be proactive and to think, first of all, and I hit this already, but I would encourage people again to understand their internal process. That's really important because there very well may be a form that you need to disclose. There may be a specific person that you need to disclose to. So there's a number of things within the process, the enterprise, the company's process. So I think that's what I would encourage first, is to know what the process is so you can do it appropriately. Then I think what's also important is to really think about what your impairment, your disability, your chronic health condition, the challenge that it's presenting at work. And I encourage that because oftentimes the employer is not fluent or is not very educated in terms of specific disabilities. So they don't know the implications of that in the workplace. So you as the person with a disability need to build that bridge for them. You need to help them understand that, again, I have a medication change. I have to take it at 7 o'clock in the morning, and this really creates an issue with me being at work at 8. So can I have a more flexible schedule for the next 3 weeks until that clearly, something like that. So you really need to build a bridge for the employer to help them understand, I am a person with a disability, This is challenges, the limitations that I'm facing because of this disability at this moment. And this is what I have to do at work, and this is where it's creating the challenge for me. So let me just think about different ideas, how we can overcome, and then propose a few accommodations, and that's where the Job Accommodation Network can come in. You know, for you to be proactive and be prepared, you can call Melanie. Melanie can talk you through it, offer a number of different accommodations that might work for you in that circumstance, and then you can propose different accommodations. And you can just say, and you know, the employer may think, oh, well, this one doesn't work, but yeah, maybe that one works. So let's go with that one. So,
yeah, and I think one of the things you need to be prepared, the individual or employer can request that they have medical doc and shows that the person does have. So you want to add and think how much, even possibly have that letter or the information from the doctor ready to provide when you ask. As Lou said, there may be internal policy, or sometimes they don't write a letter. We recommend that they put the request in writing, but you're not required to do that. Something as simple as, hey, I'm having trouble getting to work on time because of medication I take for talk about that. And so it can be that simple. Have that written. You can always talk to your employer about it and then follow that up in writing. And that just gives you, did ask for an accommodation.
And so everyone knows that we do have an accommodation form. If you are at one of those employers that really are not familiar with this process, do not have a good process or a form in place, then we do have a form that you can complete and attach your medical information that too in order to provide that accommodation. We also have a mobile accommodation solution app. It's a free downloadable app. And as an individual with a disability, you can go in and use that app to track your accommodations, make notes on your accommodations, and complete a form, the interactive request form, and then submit that to your employer. So that's one of the tools that we provide.
And what was the name of that app?
It's the Mobile Accommodation Solution app. And it's in the Apple Store as well as...
something that isn't asked directly in the questions, but it seems implied, is that a lot of people don't have the words to use to begin the conversation. They don't know how to approach it. And I think that's what they're getting at too when they say, what is the best way? Is they need like the sentence to begin the conversation, and they just don't have that. Do you have something like that for them?
We have a simple sample accommodation letter. And it just simply states, I'm asking for an accommodation, or like I stated earlier, I'm having trouble getting my reports done on time because I get distracted in the afternoon. You know, it can be as simple as that, just so that the employer, at first, just so the employer understands what you're saying, that there is a problem conduct, and you're relating it to back. Just, you know, if a person just goes to their employer and says, you know, hey, I'm just kind of distracted, doesn't relate it to a medical condition or a disability, the employer's not sure if that's the ADA or what, and so they can always ask questions to clarify. But it's a really good idea to think that through, simplest way possible, explain what the difficulties that you're having on the job and how your disability relates.
And I think, too, the context, the environment's really important, too. So what I would also encourage people to do is to plan it, schedule it, ask for a private room. This isn't something that you want to talk about in the hallway while you're in between projects. This is something that is very personal, very private, and you really want the full attention. So I think setting up the important is how you. So set it up, private room, conference room with your supervisor. Perhaps HR needs to be involved because they're more educated about really what needs to happen, and they're listening for a request for accommodation. And then, as Melanie said, just put it out. I'm really having a problem doing this. This is the impairment or chronic health condition I have, thinking that these things might help me. What do you? And I think really to humanize it as much as possible and to make it as least intimidating as possible and as positive as possible, too. So you come with options. You're not just coming to put it all out there and for them to solve all of the issues. You want to propose some ideas. You're part of the discussion. You're part of the negotiation. I think that's really important because, as we know, even in this day and age, there's just still so much stigma around disability, and even more so around mental health. We all wish it wasn't so, but so we need to deal with that. And the way that we deal with that is just to be prepared. We want to normalize mental health conversations as much as possible, workplace, as much as we need to in order to disclose and ask for an accommodation. And this is the way, very authentic. We're going to be very human, and let's just take the intimidation out of it for everybody. This is what I'm experiencing, kind of what
This is from Mercy and Ilan, and they both are asking about ways to find jobs from employers who are accommodating. Is there a resource out there that, is a collection of these employers are really progressive? Or, how do they identify the type of employers that'll work well with people with disabilities?
So there's a number of things that I would look for. First of all, I had mentioned the United States Business Leadership Network before. I would go to the USBLN site and look at all the corporations who have sponsored and who are engaged in the U.S. I would go to Diversity Inc., a magazine. I would put in my web browser 10 top companies for disability in Disability Inc., and you will pull up those 10 companies that are most inclusive of people with disabilities. So that's what I would start doing. I would also be aware that in the federal sector that there is a Schedule A provision, which is in many ways, an affirmative action program for people with disabilities to become hired in the federal government. So I would know that the federal government would be in that. It would be in my. So if I was doing the discovery in order to approach employers, that's sort of the approach that I would take. Now, if I were just looking at a specific employer, I would go to their website. I would want to know how they provide their equal employment opportunity state. Is it buried somewhere, 10 pages, 10 clicks, or is it on the third page? I would go to the career portal. How about a button that says request an accommodation? Is that on the first page, second page, third page, or is that buried 7 clicks? Those are some of the things that tell me that the company is more inclusive and thinking about. I would look at their visuals. I would look at any marketing. Are individuals with disabilities, with various disabilities, included in their marketing? So that's some of the ways that some of the cues that I would use to know whether or not that company, and then further that informs me in terms of my the way that I disclose, when I disclose, who I disclose to. So builds out this scenario for me, so I know what.
Well, with that, then we'll move on to a question. Joan asks, what is the best practice for corrective actions with individuals who self-sabotage their jobs and will not give a valid reason for the sabotage? After losing the job that was connected to their specific career path, they complain about needing a job, so they want to resume the job search in the same area. And they say it also seems to be connected to attention.
Well, I think that's one of the toughest situations, a very challenging situation. I think, though, that ultimately people should be allowed to fail. And if they sabotage themselves and they're getting the other supports that they need, I'm not sure that there's a lot about it. And, it's so complicated because, as I mentioned before, the stigma with mental health. My experience is that I've seen people lose their jobs instead of really being upfront and be willing to put themselves out there to disclose and ask for an accommodation that we believe could work. Again, that's not a decision that I can make for anybody besides myself. And if that's their decision, then I'm not sure that there's much that we can do about that. If they have very specific sabotage behaviors, I'm supporting that person, I'm an advocate, family member, then I'm certainly going to engage with them and point out those sabotage behaviors and just talk about what my experience is as their advocate or family member in seeing this happen, and see if there's any way that I can influence their behavior ultimately with a job.
I was just thinking about.
And if they're still employed, then always remember too that many of the large employers have employee assistance programs, EAPs as they're traditionally called, although sometimes they're called different things in enterprises within companies. So if I'm a coworker and that person engages with me and I'm close enough for them to disclose and for them to ask my support, then you may want to direct people assistance program of the company. And perhaps they can help them. They can counsel them and provide that support so that they can be more objective about sabotage. But admittedly, I think that's one of the largest challenges sometimes.
All right, thank you. Debbie in the room asks, what are the separate obligations for communications-related accommodations, even as they might apply to a person with an intellectual disability, spectrum-related functional limitations, etc.? Yeah. So, and I think the broader subject is disclosing and dealing with intellectual disabilities as well. But her specific question is, what are the separate obligations for communications-related accommodations, even as they might apply to a person with an intellectual disability, spectrum-related functional limitations, etc.?
Sure. And the complexity there, of course, is, is there a service provider involved? I'm going to presume that if somebody has an intellectual disability, that they may be working with a service provider, and the employer may be informed. I can tell you when we talk to employers, we coach them on when you are working with somebody with an intellectual disability that, to very closely monitor your language so that they're certainly understand what you're requesting. And in terms of communication, again, as Melanie stated, under the law and under the it's just required that the person share that they have a medical condition that it's interfering with work. So it could be a very simple verbal statement, which again, on the flip side, when we talk to employers and supervisors, oftentimes what we just suggest is if somebody brings up a medical condition, then they have the responsibility to clarify with that person to really understand why they're disclosing that disability, because it may be accommodation related or it may not. Best practice there, I think, for employers really is just to take a step back and just say, I understand that you're disclosing this medical, but what I need to do to understand, to make sure that I live up to my responsibility and I comply with the law, is to understand if you're asked. So, that's what we, and again, so if we're looking at just specific communication, so it could be a simple verbal statement, right? Or it could be that advocate, service provider, family member assists the person with that letter, and using the format and using the letter, the interactive form that we've developed. So, either of those approaches, I think, could be effective in request. I hope we were clear on that. I'm still not sure that we really hit that well, but if the person could ask supplemental questions, or if they can tease it out a little better for us, then we're certainly open.
Yeah, and I don't see anything from them yet, but if they do post again, I'll bring it back up. I got a couple of questions here in the room now, and even in the submitted ones, around disclosing anxiety, disability request, and people seem to, want to help how to specifically go about an anxiety related accommodation request. Do you have advice that's specific to them, or is it the same as what you've been?
I think one of the things people want to be clear on is they need to provide about what's caused. That's what it comes down to. A lot of times employers, from the information that we receive, employers will get requests from docs, stress-free job or an anxiety-free workplace, and that's not really possible. But at least I don't think that is.
Right, I don't think so.
So what is it about the workplace or the job that has caused maybe something, in their personal life, things from home that are an issue, but what are the things on the job that are exacerbating the anxiety? Is it the Labor Act job tasks that are a certain order that need to be done in a certain order? They have that specific, so the employer can understand that, because if they're going to try to reduce that anxiety in the workplace, they really need to know where that anxiety is coming from.
And again, I just want to hone in on what I said earlier too. Is so when you're looking at disclosure and requesting accommodation, you have a medical condition you want to list. You are having a challenge at work, which you want to provide to the employer. So you're building that bridge, and then, if possible, you want to propose a couple of solutions. Right? You want to be proactive and as positive as possible. And that's really the way.
So just moving along so we can get through more of these. This question is kind of flipping the question around. It says Rupali, and they ask, what questions can the HR human resources person ask a candidate with disability about their disability? So as the employer, what can I ask someone who's disclosed?
Well, and that last part of it is really what I'm listening for, because I wouldn't expect that anyone would be asking about my disability unless I disclose and let them know that I had some kind of limit, I was having a challenge. So really, people should not be, in HR, ER, or diversity and inclusion, should be asking about this. And there's an exception, and I'll talk about that. But unless you've disclosed, right? And then once you've disclosed and you're asking for an accommodation, then they engage in what's called the interactive process. And then it's their obligation, really, to sort out whether your disability is covered, whether they understand enough about your disability that they can and accommodations, and then understand the kind of accommodations that could work for you in that specific. So I hope that's clear. The exception to that, of course, is that if a company has a federal contract has a contract with the federal government, in which case they fall under Section 503 under the Rehabilitation Act. They more than likely have to have an affirmative action depending upon the cost of the contract that will. So they'll have to have an affirmative action program, and what they'll have to do is that there is a goal out there of 7% of your workforce should be people with disabilities. That's an aspirational goal. So in order to meet that goal, they have to collect. So everyone that's hired with that federal contractor may be asked to self-identify and to complete a form, which is a governmental form designed by the department. So in that circumstance, you may run that type of, and that we call that self-identify, not disclosure. But it's very confusing for people. I can just tell you. And I can tell you it's confusing for supervisors, and it's confusing for individuals with disabilities looking for work, starting to work at an organization when that form is presented to them. But so there's just two very distinct processes. One is disclosing, requesting accommodation, and the other one is self-identifying specifically for employer or future employer to meet the obligations of Section 5.
And then going off of that question that they asked, as an employer, are there questions that they shouldn't be asked? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think very specifically, but there isn't, but employers do. We have to be real about that. And you also have to be prepared, I think, to take that question, turn it around, positive as way as you possibly can to get around. Because I think many employers are not very far along on the inclusion continuum I've spoken of before, and they're going to ask inappropriate questions. I think that's just, it really need to be prepared, and you need to be prepared then to kind of move past that question and to get at maybe the roots of what they're asking. What employers are permitted to ask, if I disclose a disability and I say that I have this type of challenge, then what they very well may do is, and they may do this for all candidates, but they can ask, how could you perform? So if you have that specific disability, could you just tell me, okay, so, how would particular process that's on the job, tell me that. And that's most typical. That's what most employers are going to ask, and that's within that sort of safe area for employers to ask, is that how would you perform then a certain aspect of the, but if But if an employer is asking personal questions about your medical condition, meds you're on, then I would just encourage them and keep re-steering them to the accommodation. And this is the way that I would do my job in a positive way. Because you want the job, right? Ultimately, you want the job. You want to set an example. You want to blaze the path. And you want to be that person now that's successful in the organization so that organization can grow beyond disability, and disability is more normal, right? That's what we all want to move towards. That's the world we want to move towards, right? So you want to engage with them in a positive way, and you really just want to keep steering them to, this is the job that I have to do, even though I have this disability. I know I can do it. No?
Oh, that's That's exactly.
I'm going to group two questions here. One from Carolyn, who asks, what happens when my employer finds out about my mental illness? Do I have to disclose? And then Allison in the room asks, if you ask for sick time for an employment, can your supervisor ask what kind of?
Okay, so first of all, whether you need to ask, the first part of
Supervisor finds out, you have to disclose that.
No,
and I don't know how your supervisor finds that out. And one of the things that we recommend, you don't disclose to everybody, so you want to be really careful at the workplace who you tell what. There are people who just tell everything about themselves and all their problems, and then they get upset that comes back. And so the best thing is not to be secretive or hide it. I don't mean that, but just not disclose to everyone of that information.
But and to go back to the supervisor, of what use would that be to the supervisor to know that you have health? Unless I need an accommodation, that is the only way that it's relevant to both me, and if it has something to do with my productivity is not what it needs to be, or something of that sort. So not really appropriate for the supervisor to ask about a mental health. Although I totally agree with Mel, some people unfortunately position themselves in such a way that they tell everyone everything, and again, we're not as educated as they need to be in the workplace about mental health disabilities or disabilities in general, and so these things do happen. Again, if my supervisor did approach me and want to talk about it, I would say that information is really confidential, and I prefer not to discuss it.
Now, one of the questions we get frequently, we suspect somebody has a mental health impairment. What do we do? And our advice is go along as you would for anyone else. If there's a conduct issue, if there's a performance, address it as that. You don't bring anything else. You don't say, do you have a disability, do you have a medical? You can say, here's where your performance is, here's where we need it to be, how can we help? Kind of the same thing as asking about. That way you're not assuming someone has. And that gives the employee then the disclose that if they do have a mental health impairment at that time or not. Sometimes that might be a good time to disclose. Supervisors bringing up a performance or a conduct, and some employees close at that time and others won't. But we will direct employers to not go down that path until the employee actually says, yes, they do have a medical, and then talk.
Janet asks us if you have resources for Canadians, where can they look for information about accommodation?
Sure. Well, what I would do is I would go straight to askjan.org, our website. In the question box, I would put mental health, and that's probably, then it'll pull up, the way that our website works is it pulls up all the documents that we have, all of the compliance documents, the accommodation documents, etiquette documents, it all comes up under that. And typically the first publication is the one that is the most thorough and the number of accommodations. We also have a searchable online accommodation resource called SOAR, and it's a tool that people also use to search for accommodation. But ultimately, remember that our core service is people can call our 800 number, they can chat, they can use Skype, they can email us, they can use our office, our virtual office in Second Life, and talk to our avatar if they're really uncomfortable about talking about their mental health condition, which happens. So there's just a myriad of ways that one can contact us. And what we'll do is we coach you through the entire process. So, this is what my employer said. Now what do I do the next step, kind of thing. And I think that that's where we can be really instrumental in supporting you on calling all along. We have a case management tool. If you want to provide your name, then we set up a case for you. If you're not really confident and you don't trust that your information will be kept confidential, as some people are leery of, then you could just be anonymous. The only thing is that creates issues that we don't know what your past record is, so we can't kind of start with you where we ended the last. So we'll definitely support you through that process and give you tips on, this is what my employer said now, is that appropriate? No, that's not appropriate, but let's try to approach it this way to either get you that job or.
Yeah, you actually answered a different question. I think I stuttered, but that was a really useful answer for all these people who seem to be looking for help just for them. But the question was for Canada, the neighbors just to the north of us. Where can they look for resources about accommodations? Do you know, or? Oh,
well, there is. Okay, so first of all, anyone globally can use our website. So all that information is available. And we've worked with a number of countries. Australia has replicated the JAN model wholesalely. Taiwan, our publications, South Korea, we've done some work there. So there's a number of countries that we have worked with to replicate aspects of. Japan has replicated our searchable accommodation online resource, our SOAR. I understand that there is a group that is your vocational rehabilitation group. Almost had their name, but W something in Canada, and I know that they assist and provide information that we provide. I believe it's proprietary. I think you either have to be a member, but ultimately you can access any of our information online or email or use our searchable accommodation resource, that SOAR service that we have, and we do not block requests from.
Nina asked, and this is from an employer, if accommodation is requested in a format process that is outside of the employer's typical process, must the accommodation still be considered or granted?
Can they give me an example of that?
She's typing. So see, I think it's that they have a formal method of requesting accommodations, if I'm to guess, and it's someone going outside of that method, not following the internal process of the company.
Right. So let's go back to our original conversation at the beginning. The EEOC only requires that a person disclose verbally and say medical condition and challenge at work. That is a disclosure. That is enough information that under the law, the employer has now an obligation to move forward with the interaction. So let's start there. However, if, say, for instance, a person asks for it verbally, from their supervisor, which is not outside of our process. Our process is you go to Human Resources, to our disability specialist, and they haven't done that, and they haven't completed the paperwork. Then what I would suggest is that the person in HRER or D&I steer that person to the process, inform them of the process, and provide support that they need in order to complete the process. So say it is somebody with an intellect, and they're not really able to complete the forms that need to be completed. The employer has that continuous obligation to assist that person with the accommodation process. And it could be an alternate way that we typically do. So once that person discloses, requests an accommodation, it's obvious that this is an accommodation request, then the obligation moves to the employer. And at that point, regardless of what their policies and procedures are, they have been alerted by the regulations, and they need to move forward.
I'll just say that frontline supervisors need to be trained in what to do. If they receive a request, but it's not up to them to do that, then they direct that person to go to, or they forward that. Right. That it just doesn't lie there on the supervisor's desk.
And that's where we can help employers, too. So what we developed over the last couple of years is called the Workplace Accommodation Toolkit, and we have sample policies and procedures and also metrics for benchmarking and monitoring your accommodation program. Also, what we suggest is best practice is having, at the very least, a spreadsheet tracking system, but also getting a accommodation tracking system so that you can track. What we find is that so many times problems are created when there's a new supervisor. When information isn't conveyed appropriately and timely to an individual who has the responsibility to directly accommodate. That's where we find really as a real sore spot. So that's really important for accommodations to be tracked. We would encourage that. And we have samples. We can either provide you with the Excel spreadsheet as a sample, or we can provide you with a list of vendors that make those accommodation tracks.
We're starting to run out of time here, so I'm going to wrap this up pretty soon. So we're going to do two last questions. One comes from Xiao Yen, and they ask, has there been any research findings on how to best approach disclosure, specifically on whether it turns out to be more favorable for the person with mental health issues to disclose at his or her workplace, not at all or selectively? And if selectively, would you agree that it works well or best if they disclose only to the head of the organization they're employed by, or to their immediate supervisor, for example? Just, the general research and the best way to do it. Is that out there or?
And you know what? I'm not familiar with that type. Are you guys, David? Do you have anything there at Boston?
Not that I am individually aware of, but there's so many of us that someone could be working on it and I wouldn't know.
Sure, maybe that's something that we could look at together. So I'm not so much based in research, but I can certainly say from the JAN perspective, we receive 47,000 consultations or conduct 47,000 consultations at least per year. So we have a pretty decent grasp over what's happening. And again, it's so situational that I think that really is where the focus needs to be. Is on, the organization, their policies and practices. I don't find anyone that would disclose, or somebody in the C-suite or in the VP suite, the vice president, not really appropriate. It would be, I would look at the policies and procedures and I would follow them. If there is a subject matter expert, a consultant, an internal consultant on disability issues, that's the person that you really want to talk to. That's the person who knows the process. That's the person who's most sensitive. That's how I would make my determination. I don't think on a large scale, understanding the dynamics out there are really helpful. I think you really need to focus on what your needs are first, understanding your needs, understanding how to request those needs, and what kind of accommodations would work, and then understanding how you then connect with the organization. Where do you plug in this information? I think that's what makes it so situational and so challenging, admittedly, for both the employer and doubt about it. But I think you really need to, your advocate, family members supporting you need to sort that out. Those determinations based on your situation, on your company, on their processes. That's what I would.
No, the only thing I would say, generally want to go to HR, not your supervisor, about the diagnosis getting out, because the person, whoever does that, keeps that information confidential, needs that medical, and yes, there is a disability on, then they file that away, and that is kept confidential. No one else has access. That is probably the best. Now, as I said earlier, sometimes the supervisor involved in the accommodation process. Say someone wants to work from home, and HR says, well, we don't see a problem with that. But the supervisor involved to make sure that's really something that's going to be effective, and to know that the person's working at home and not, but they don't need to know anything about the just the limitations, which could, lots of different disabilities that men have.
And I think it's important. I think you're absolutely right, Mel, and I think it's just important to note that. So, and then that HR person in employee relations or in D&I should only be sharing information on an as-need-to-know basis, which means no medical information, only the functional information that person needs in order to provide that. And then just very quickly, too, so the group in Canada that has a similar service, but I think it is proprietary for pay, is the Job Accommodation Service. We worked with them a couple of decades ago, and they're sponsored by the Canadian Council on
Well, we are out of time. And I wanted to thank everyone in the room for trying to help each other out, because we were not able to get to even half the questions today. And I want to thank both you, Lou, and Mel, for answering the questions everyone had, and really everyone for attending. Thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.